Welcome to the Gang Gang Votes podcast, presented by the Boston Community Action Team.
Members here today, we're going to be discussing the Boston Police Department. Where do we want to start today?
I think we could start with the scope of the BPD. If we look into the budget specifically, you can see that it's the second largest line item in the city of Boston behind education, which I think is a really telling position for it to be in. To be specific, this year for the fiscal year 2021 budget, the proposed budget was $414 million, which ended up being an adopted budget of $404 million. But the Boston fiscal year 2022 budget is $399.87 million, which sure is like a 5% cut from proposed by Kim Janey. But when we just think about how much money that is and how much power the BPD has, being the second priority to education in this city, it's something that's really important to consider. And I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on, the way that Boston prioritizes the police department.
Yes, I find it very interesting how we do set aside so much money to Boston PD, and in the scheme of things, Boston is still one of the most unsolved, or has the highest rates of unsolved murder cases in the whole country. How can that be possible?
Yeah, I also think one thing that we pride ourselves in, or one thing that we're definitely known for, is our education in Boston, right? For university or for college, a lot of people across the country and the world come to Boston. But another thing to note is kind of the prevalence of the police department in our city and how much that's been ingrained into our history. And I know that we were talking about that a little bit before, but considering that we were talking about slave catchers in the history of BPD, I think that it's really problematic that we've still continued to invest so much money into that organization. Or into that community of policing. And so I really want to see not only, I know under Kim Janey, we cut about 5%, as Emma was saying, but I think for viewers, it's really important to go on to whoever your front runner is for the mayoral election and really figure out what they're going to do to change BPD, that funding, and maybe even possibly reallocating it into the communities that are being over-policed.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it's it's critically important to recognize our history, right? I feel like Boston prides themselves on being one of the first police departments in the country. But also recognizing, Ariella said, Boston police started out as slave catchers. And we're not recognizing the trauma that is tied to the foundation of the BPD and how it still relates into today, right? Because Black and brown people are the most stopped. When we think about stop and frisk, when we think about all of those discriminatory practices that are happening, it is still happening with Black and brown people. But then you look at the history and you'll see that they were slave catchers for Black and brown people. The connection is very, very much not confusing. It's not confusing, but I think it's important to recognize our history, where the BPD started from, and what are they willing to do to address the history. I think it's something that I'm interested in as well, because I know we pride ourselves as Boston in being the proudest first department, or one of the first departments, but we're not talking about the history and how that relates to today. So I agree with all of you.
Yeah, and I think that we should be considerate of how much stop and frisk really goes into that. At a Mayoral Forum that we all went to last week, it was from the Madison Park Development Corporation, also connected to BCAT. And one of the questions was for trafficking, like, will you allow certain trafficking stops to happen? And it was just a yes or no question for the mayoral candidates. But if we were to look at those statistics, I know that that's really prevalent. Traffic stops as well as stop and frisks. And I think that that's where a lot of Black and Brown people are afraid. If we look at a lot of the situations that have been recorded in the last even 5 years, it's really being on the highway or just being on the street driving and getting pulled over for no reason, either because you fit the description or just because, even if you are breaking the law, but then you're targeted because of stereotypes, and those stereotypes are being perpetuated. So seeing a Black man who maybe ran a red light, then you kind of use that predisposition or what you already believe about that person and use it to say, well, we know that this wasn't a mistake. We know that this is just the type of behavior that you and your specific demographic does. And I think that that's been even more noticeable with the march that happened for George Floyd this past year as it went into downtown, just some of the behavior, like when a woman had her hands up, she was backing away from the police and they hit her with the baton anyways. I mean, it's that kind of behavior that's excused that allows for us to continue to perpetuate stereotypes. And it's definitely something that we need to stop. So it's not only about like divesting from BPD and maybe reallocating that money somewhere else, but also about changing the behavior and what behavior we deem as acceptable.
Yeah, definitely from a moral and infrastructure standpoint, I 100% agree.
Yeah, and when you bring up the Mayoral Forum, I think it was really interesting because in such a simple question, like, will you address these discrepancies that happen within like stop and frisk programs or things like that, like traffic stops, like what that leads to depending on who you are in Boston, and like there were not clear answers to that question whatsoever.
Even though it was yes or no,
Right.
at first, like one of the mayoral candidates was like, clarify, do you mean like this kind of traffic stop? And then they changed their answer from like no to yes, I think because everyone else was kind of saying yes. But then there were other candidates that were really straightforward about their support for BPD, right? And they were getting some negative comments in the chat. I'm not going to say who it was. If you were there, but definitely just seeing, where these different candidates stand on really big issues, one of them being the BPD.
Right.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I feel like Boston is very much not, like a lot of people don't talk about the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors that we do have in Boston, because the BPD in the last 10 to 20 years have killed Black and Brown people. And so I've actually worked with one of the mothers who lost her son to violence, the gun violence, because a cop killed her son. And so, and actually somebody in my family back in the 90s got killed from a police officer in Boston. So it's very much relevant to today. And I think a lot of people don't realize, like, there are George Floyds, there was a Black woman who recently just died in police custody in Boston. That was from Boston. So a lot of these issues are happening, but it's not making media outlet headlines. I'm not surprised, but when I go onto the news, when I go on to different news channels, I'm wondering, okay, why aren't they talking about the Black woman that just died in custody? And there was a Black man who also died in police custody in Boston. But I can only see that these things are happening on social media, like Facebook. And I think, I know there's some moments where Facebook can be problematic. And at the same time, it's bringing awareness to a lot of the issues that are going on that these main media outlets are not telling. And I think that's accountability on our elected officials. That's accountability on our local news channels and the stories that they choose to to cover. Like, I think there's accountability on a lot of people when it comes to the BPD getting away. And not only that, but they made the news. They made CNN. They made national news headlines with the barbaric behavior that they were exhibiting at the protests downtown for George Floyd that happened in late May. And how police officers were literally making fun of innocent protesters, peaceful protesters, and talking, I'm gonna pepper spray this person, or I want to pepper spray that dude, out of laughter. Mm-hmm. Like, and that happened last year. Like, all of this is very much relevant. So
yeah, and I think that I think that there's a clear power imbalance in the city when it comes to police officers in every city in the country. And I think that a lot, especially the BPD, try to front themselves or at the front line say, you know, we're about integrity and getting our job done. But as Warren was saying, we're the state with the highest, most unsolved cases, you know? And so they say, you know, we're getting these done, or, you know, they'll mention statistics like we had a crackdown on this year, but then they're straying away from the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors that Carrie was talking about. When this past year, when we were talking about SROs, like, you know, officers in school, right? Because we were talking about restorative justice, like an offline conversation. I go to a school in Roxbury that's almost directly across the street from a BPD headquarters. And they're saying, you know, why do you all require like SROs when the BPD is right across the street from your school? And so whether it's a question about having in-school officers, it's like they're clearly not doing our job as people right across the street from us to make sure that we feel safe. We have lockdowns all the time. They're right around the corner, and they don't do anything to make sure that we really feel like we're being protected. And I think that you definitely see discrepancies based off of the demographics. So for example, if we're looking at Nubian Square, right, there's a BPD headquarters in Nubian Square. All of the different things that happen there's definitely not a crackdown on, whether that's, you know, trafficking, drugs, sex trafficking. I've gone by, like, you know, pimps, like, you know, I've seen that situation happen very, very close to, like, in Nubian Square, or even just certain relationships. And when homeless people or young youth, there was an incident when I think like a fire truck hit a young youth at Nubian Square, and the BPD were like being very, very aggressive towards, you know, people who lived there. If we were to see something like this happen in Copley, I mean, the response is almost, you know, 10 times faster because they view it as an issue. They don't view people who live in Copley the same as people who live in Roxbury. And so even if we're talking about, or if we're saying there's been a higher crackdown or that the BPD has been doing more in the Roxbury, Mattapan, Dorchester area, that's also due to a lot of the gentrification that's happening, right? And you want to protect the people who are trying to invest in these neighborhoods and really buy out the people who have been living there for a while. So I feel like it really dips into a bunch of different areas.
Yeah. And I think that like all of you have said, like, it doesn't take that much examination to see that over-policing does not decrease crime or increase safety in Boston communities whatsoever. And so you have people saying, well, if the police aren't, you know, doing what police are defined to do, then, like, you know, they're calling to defund the police, etc. There are so many different, like, avenues. Like, people are desperate for safety in a way that is actually, you know, safe and community-led and, like, wanted by the communities it's meant to serve. But in that sense, like, I think it's important to look at the fact that, like, Kim Janey has cut 5% from the budget. However, when you look into that, it's not actually addressing what defund the police is, you know, trying to address at the root, because, you know, she's targeting overtime. I think police overtime spending within the budget, which was like a $22 million cut in overtime, which is actually a $4.9 million cut if you look into like the ACLU reportings, because it was, you know, it's a thing between proposed budgets and actual budget, so it gets like tricky when you get into it. But one of the plans in that proposal was to hire 50 more officers in order to decrease overtime spending. So when it comes to that, it's like defund the police did not mean hire more police officers.
Oh my gosh. And that's what happened. Like at the Mayoral Forum, one of the candidates said, this might sound off, but we actually need to hire more police to solve the policing issue in Boston. And however you may feel about that, you need to do a better job at explaining it, especially to a Black and Brown community. You really need to break that down. You need to have like infographics. If you're really serious about leading the city, people who are experiencing trauma from police don't want to hear that we need to hire more police. And even like for an instance with the situation with Kim Janey, a 5% increase, and then you actually look at the numbers, like what's happening and what is actually being decreased, and just how that's changing. And so it's very easy, especially even for the BPD, to say like, we had like, let's say 3% decrease in, sex trafficking in this area. But when you're not really able to look at the scheme of things, I mean, like the overall issue, and then look specifically at the details, it's really hard to weigh whether that was a good option or not, or what that's actually going towards, which is why, organizations such as BCAT, we really try to break that down in infographics that are, understandable and accessible for our community. And I think that that's an important job because so many people aren't doing that. When you're saying we actually need to increase police officers instead of decrease them, well, we can look at a bunch of social media pages and we're not really seeing any explanation as to why, that might be happening.
Exactly. Go ahead, Warren.
I think we're underestimating the power of media and what we have here as BCAT right now. I think when we look at media and the aspect of things, or in Boston in general, we didn't see real change with the overtime scandal until it came to the media. We won't see real change with anything until we operate as a media, when we use our influence to do so and educate people, because all things are stemming from the media. Like, they show the biggest platform, they have the biggest lens, millions of people see it every day. It's like, when do we become the source for news, real news that people need to see? Because once you see it,
absolutely. Like, images do so much for the mind rather than words. Carrie, I know you were going to say something, but I think that that's also why earlier she was saying, like, Facebook in many ways, aside from, the scandals, which we could have a whole podcast about that, has done a decent job at allowing people to spread certain messages, especially about things that are happening in Boston. So I'm going to pass it over to her.
Yeah, when you were talking about sex trafficking and talking about, it just makes me think about how Black girls, and specifically Black women, are the number one missing demographic in America.
Yeah. And
so when we're talking about police departments across the country, and not only Boston, doing their job, I would need more evidence. Like, point me where, like, what are your strategies to make sure that you are protecting Black girls? Because obviously the data is showing that we're going missing the most, and just girls in general, or just missing kids in general. And I think a lot of that plays into how much focus they put into certain communities. The care that the Boston police have for Copley, or whenever there's a riot because the Red Sox lost the game in the Fenway, looks very different from when there's a protest happening in the Grove Hall area, or there's supposed to be a protest happening in Boston. Like, the care looks different depending on the skin color, and that's just facts. And there's statistics and there's evidence to support that. I think, like, it just doesn't make sense to me why they're, like, when it comes to elected officials, some of them, because I know there are some elected officials who are working to push on defunding the police and reallocating more funding. But for some elected officials, I don't understand the pushback or why they're challenging reallocating money to decrease recidivism, reallocating money into housing, reallocating money into root causes, dismantling the root causes which cause people or force people in the circumstances to perpetuate or have to act in crime or like, you know, do things just to survive.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of it is common sense.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. When you're experiencing it, when you know people who are experiencing it, it's common sense for you. It just makes sense, you know. You see a family friend get pulled over by the police or targeted, and you say, you know, well, they wouldn't be doing this if they had enough money to, you know, provide for their house, or they wouldn't be doing this if they had better education, or if they had access to certain resources. And I think for people, especially policymakers, it's just very hard for them to understand where I as a Black woman am coming from, where you as a Black woman am coming from, because there aren't a lot of Black women who are policymakers currently. I mean, if that's really how we want to break it down, BCAT really preaches that we need to have representatives who represent us, who represent that demographic. You know, you wouldn't want someone who was a fisherman coming and telling you how to catch beavers. I mean, that was a really like off metaphor, but you get what I'm saying. Like, you don't want someone who doesn't understand your experience to try to represent you and figure out how to solve that experience. And even more, you don't want someone who, one, doesn't know your experience, but isn't open to understanding or learning about your experience. And I think that that's really where the barrier is right now. People are so stuck in their own opinions and in their own views that it's really hard for them to have conversations. And that's ultimately because of the way that we were socialized, but it's also because it's also because of the way that the BPD operates. I mean, there's schemes, there's, you know, inappropriate behavior in every almost every organization or big corporation that you will encounter.
How do go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So this is interesting, right? Because I think, like, can we just talk about how detrimental the blue wall of silence is in our society? Like, how did the BPD manage to get away with a child molestation scandal back in the 90s? And a lot of people are just now finding out about it. Like, this is exactly what we mean. Who holds the police accountable for when they're doing injustices? Who holds them accountable? And then when are they going to be, like, when are they willing to hold themselves accountable? Because elected officials in Boston did hold a police accountability hearing for the community, and they didn't show up.
Yeah, no one showed up.
Right.
Because that's what I was saying in the last episode. Police, you know, enforce police.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one else that's going to hold a police officer accountable other than a police officer, because that is how the system has been set up. Like, when a police officer, again, is being prosecuted, right, in court, who are the prosecutors? People that they go to work with every day, people who live on their streets, you know, and that's why we have, you know, sheriffs, and that's why we have other prosecutors saying, you know, I knew Tommy, you know, he's been a great man. His daughter and my daughter used to go to gymnastics practice every day. I know that he shot this Black man, you know, because he thought he was holding he thought he was holding a gun, but it was actually a water gun. But come on, I know Tommy, and he just doesn't deserve anything over like 10 years. We're talking about killing a human being, and we're justifying it because the person prosecuting you is your friend.
Right.
And yeah.
I got a question. I'm not sure if I'm the only one who's seeing this ideology being pushed by some elected officials, but how do you all feel about the concept of we need to hire more, or like hiring more Black and brown cops as a solution? How do you guys feel about that?
I feel like this is I feel like this piece is more controversial than the whole idea about talking about the BPD, just like the idea of hiring more Black and brown cops. Um, let's see. I think, and we were talking about this last time, the BPD is really a brotherhood. Any police department is. And so, and a lot of people have been talking about this, right? A Black or a brown police officer go in saying, I'm going to change it from the inside. I'm going to teach people and I'm going to hold that responsibility all on myself. I'm going to be the person to do that. And then they get into the department a couple years after and they really see how it is. They see how the scheme is, they see how the relationship is, and they realize, I can't do this alone. I can't do this without a group of people supporting me. And so you kind of get integrated into that culture. And so I think that we're more so when we incentivize Black and brown people to go and become police officers, we're taking them away from the violence that's actually happening. I think that they're less perceptive and it's not easy for them to realize how they're being integrated into this culture and really taking them back to what a police officer is actually, or what they claim they're supposed to do. I think that you get taken away from your purpose when you do that.
Yeah, I think that the culture of police departments is like something that's really important to like keep a close eye on, because you have people who are like, say there's a bunch of people training to become police officers and one person feels very strongly about their role and being accountable, and they see that other people are doing malpractice or causing harm, and they report that to their higher up, and often it's that person who's going to get harmed or hazed or whatever for speaking up, because they are compromising the integrity or the structure of the department as a whole. So it comes back to that like bad apples argument. Like there is no such thing. It's the department was built that way on purpose for police officers to operate a certain way, and like, so I don't know, that's where it gets a little bit fuzzy, because
Yeah, what I've
that. Sorry, go ahead.
What I've noticed is that, say a police officer who commits a heinous crime is more likely to get paid leave, a good retirement fund, than a police officer who's actually exposing some of the problems within a police department. And that's because it's about, supporting the team, supporting the integrity. And so if it's like, I shot this person, but it was just a mistake, then they get to continue with that bad apples argument, right? Like, this just happened. This person was having a really rough day, but we still think that they deserve paid leave. Whereas if it's someone who's exposing the whole system or the department or a certain group of people, then it's realizing it's not just one bad apple. It's like Emma was saying, it's a whole system, and it was designed that way to keep police officers in power in a way that they don't really always have to do their job.
Yeah, I agree. And that makes me think like, this bad apples argument, but what do you do when the roots of the tree is rotten?
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of people want to acknowledge, once again, the history, the historical trauma. And my thing is like, I don't have a problem with people who are going into the BPD with good intentions, especially if they're Black and brown. My issue becomes, are they then listening to those Black and brown officers? Are they implementing their ideas? Are they implementing their recommendations? Or is the leadership of the BPD reflective of these Black officers that you so-called want to hire? Because the higher you get into the BPD, the more white you see. And so that like that to me, I feel like as long as I don't want to knock recruiting people that reflect the community. At the same time, I don't want it to be recruitment in a tokenizing way, because the way in which it's being talked about, the way in which people are advocating for more Black and brown people to go into the police force seems very tokenizing. And just this idea of wanting to support or wanting to satisfy diversity, when that's not what diversity is at all. That's just tokenization.
Yeah, I think that it's different if someone wants to join the police department because of an experience. Like, say, you know, they had a case that was unsolved and they really want to be a part of that team. They think, you know, if they had my ideas or my, you know, my work ethic, I really think that I could have been a contribution. That's very different than, or it's very similar to when a Black person sees, are you saying something? You're on mute. Or I can't hear you. Carrie? Oh, okay. It's very similar to when a Black person, oh, you all can't hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you. You're just bugging out right now.
No, because Carrie's going like, I can't hear you.
Oh.
Yep. Got it.
Oh, okay. So what I was saying was, I think it's fine if you want to join the BPD because of an experience. Like, say there was an unsolved case in your family and you think, you know, if they had my passion, my skill, my work ethic, they could have solved this case. And that's why I want to join the BPD. It's very similar to when a person of color experiences trauma from the BPD and says, you know, I want to join an organization that educates the community on this and I want to be that change. Okay. Those are both based on experiences in wanting to make a change. I think the problem is then when we incentivize Black and brown people to join the police station for different reasons, like what Carrie was mentioning. Join the police department so you can prove that you're a good person of color, right? We need to set a better standard for what it means to be Black or brown in the United States. Join the BPD because you think you can change it from the inside, or you want to be a part of that kind of community or that kind of white community. I think that that's when it becomes a problem. And I think if that's where people are moving from, they're not going to get the results that they want to see. Yeah.
Yeah, and also like, and that's why I tell people, like, if you want to join the force, that's your decision. And at the same time, like, you cannot erase years of white supremacist tactics that you're being taught. You are literally being taught white supremacist tactics. And like, it's within your practices, it's within your protocols, it's within what you're taught as a part of your job description. So there's no erasing or getting away. Like, the tactics that they're using here are the same tactics that they're using in Israel and Palestine. And, you know, so it's like, you cannot run away from the, I guess you can say, conditioning tactics that you're told to do as a part of your job that is rooted in white supremacy and discriminatory practices, like, and wondering, like, what do the protocols and practices even look like? Like, I think it's very fair to us as civilians to learn what that looks like. And I don't think a lot of people are educated on their rights, which is why BCAT, the work that we do, is so important, because it's not only educating on, like, the political tea of what's happening in Boston, but we're also educating people on their rights.
Mm-hmm. And I think that, like, so for example, say that you're trying to solve a case in Boston, and it's really important, it's really large scale, and it's affecting a bunch of people. And so you use those tactics that Carrie was talking about, right? Even because I'm sure that they're, like, printed out or they're accessible to the public. Like, I'm sure that you can look online, you know, like, the rules, like what police officers, what the BPD is supposed to do in any situation that they encounter, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not always following the rules. In order to be skilled in anything you do, it's not about, you know, let's say that I'm trying to use this lip balm, right? And I take it off and I want to, get all of my lips or I want to get it all done. I want to get the surface area, right? And so I take off the cap, I screw the bottom, shout out to Burt's Bees, and I kind of go like this and this. But that's not quite the result that I wanted. I wanted to get it more the way that Carrie has it. I really wanted it to be like, nice, luscious, and shiny. So I can't just read the package and go like, I have to maybe do like a little swirl, right? And then I have to rub it in top to bottom. This is what happens when in any way that you're trying to be skilled. So I'm trying to crack down on a case, right? And in the BPD, I'm an enthusiastic police officer, right? And so I'm following this step by step, but then I encounter a situation that's not really in the handbook. And so then I have to think on my feet, right? That's how I'm going to get promoted, by distinguishing myself from other people. And that's when we start to ingrain our own stereotypes in the way we execute problems. Because they're not teaching you. I mean, there are bias trainings, but say that you're meeting someone who sells drugs, and one person is Latino and one person is white. Your strategy from going and cracking down on that case, or finding out who they were selling it to, how they've been doing it, is going to be so much different. And that's where we start to see the white supremacy and those specific tactics. It's not always just about the rules, which definitely does have white supremacy ingrained in it, right? But it's how we execute those rules, and then how we freestyle, like, how we want to change it to get our results. And ultimately, the results that we want based off of the system is getting more Black and brown people in jail. Those are the results. That's how the BPD, that's how organizations are getting more funding. Those are the results that they want. And so however they choose to get there is, what they want to do, whether it's the rules and the regulations that we see when we do a quick Google search, or it's that freestyle that I was talking about with the lip balm or whoever you encounter. But it's about getting certain results. And so when the result is always to make sure that we have at least a certain statistic of Black and brown people who are being policed and who are going to jail, then it's always going to come out a certain way. So people who are watching, when you all are looking at who you want to vote for the mayoral election, anyone in legislature, or even bills that are going to be passed, and you want to call a local representative, look at what they're specifically trying to do. It's not just about decreasing something by 5%, but making sure that it's also ethical, as Warren was talking about earlier.
If I might add, that analogy was a good analogy. I really like that one.
Thank you.
It was. And your point, sorry. Do you want to go first?
No, you can go.
To your point, though, about moving forward with the mayoral race coming up, with the city council race, with the governor race in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, just paying attention to what's going on forums and in interviews and stuff like that is just so important. We see on so many forums that there are people. Is it okay if we just say their names? I mean, this is public information. Anissa Asabi George and John Barros both rejected calls to dismantle the BRIC gang database in school. Mm-hmm. After clearly it being stated that is most harmful to Black and brown students. We have Anissa Asabi George, who was endorsed by former police commissioner William Gross, who also, Anissa Asabi George also rejected to remove BPD from BPS schools. There's a lot of astounding statements being made in these forums. I mean, depending on who you are, but to BCAT, that's incredibly alarming, to see such blatant, such blatant support for the BPD over all else. So those are just some examples, but the list goes on, and a lot of stuff is hidden and interwoven into policies that are less accessible to the average person and things like that. So,
and blatant ignorance, really, too. I agree with you, Emma, and those statements were very disturbing to me as a Black woman. And also just being aware that like some of those statements were made on a call where majority of the audience was Black and brown youth. Like Ariella said, if you're going to say statements like that, you need to back it up, even though there's no way to back it up. But at least consider some sort of explanation or elaboration or infographics. I mean, that's just bizarre that that's being even said, even though it's totally unethical, and statistics and data proves that doesn't
as
work.
Someone who was a BPS teacher, and this isn't us trying to say these are just marking out the facts, what a mayoral candidate is doing and what they are not doing. As someone, I feel like, who was a BPS teacher, you really get exposed to some of the trauma that your students face, whether that's because of something like the BPD, stereotyping, just different things that people experience in their day-to-day basis, trauma. And so it just doesn't feel very responsible to make a statement like that and then not really provide any explanation, because you're responsible for a city, not just a classroom anymore. You're responsible for a city, and making sure that that city feels supported, that they have information to make really good choices, well-informed choices, right? Good choices for themselves. And so I feel like if you really want to do that, if you want to be successful in doing that, you need to have a good plan, and you need to have something like an infographic, because it is going to be alarming.
Yes.
Let's give it five minutes until 5:30, right? But yeah, we can start too. I think that, like, as Carrie was saying, as a Black woman, and I remember looking at the statistic like a year and a half ago, there are about like 66,000 reported missing cases for Black women. Those are only the ones that were reported, and that was a year and a half ago. And so looking at the statistics, especially since COVID started, I'm sure it's much higher. Just really exacerbating some of that trauma and experiences that we saw before the pandemic. When we talk about the BPD at all, any candidate needs to be mentioning something along the lines of this. Not, Black women specifically are going missing, but we know that a certain demographic is going missing. I've done the research on this, especially in Boston. That's what I want to hear from a mayoral candidate, And of course, there are so many different topics. There's housing, there's, BPD, there's transit, there's healthcare. And so there's a bunch of different things that you can talk about, but on your website, you can write as much as you want. It's your own website. And so making sure that you're really putting that information and showing that you've just been thoughtful is really helpful for people when they're trying to make decisions.
Sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
Quick trigger warning, because I do want to share my story. Hold on. Sorry. Okay. Quick trigger warning, because I want to share my story. The day before my 18th birthday, 5 cops held me, my mother, and my grandmother at gunpoint. I thought I was about to lose my life. And this happened in my own driveway, on my property, on my family's property. They did not follow protocol, didn't even say put your hands up. Instinctively, as a Black person, we knew to put our hands up. That was the first time I ever had a gun pointed at my face. And so personally for me, with experiencing that trauma, I want to know from our elected officials and mayoral candidate, what does the accountability system look like in the protocols when it comes to the BPD? But mostly I want to know, what does accountability look like for people who have experienced trauma like me, for people who have lost their sons, their daughters, and their families to the BPD? What statement is said about that? And how are we holding them accountable?
Mm-hmm. And like, you know, just being straightforward with it, seeing the different actions that the BPD has taken, and then knowing that there was an accountability hearing, knowing that none of them showed up. I really don't know how you could support an organization like that. I mean, we have clips that are going to be shown in this podcast. People just walking away from police officers, and there's a range. It's not like the video just started with them walking away, at least 10-15 seconds before that started, and them just being, you know, brutalized. And so with that being said, and with all of the information that we've known and shown with these two podcasts, the one that we had 2 weeks ago and now the one that we had today, I don't know. I don't know how you can have an organization like that endorse you. I think that it really is about power. The BPD is a power structure, and power can help, right? You know, we always talk about power to the people, putting power to our voices, to our experiences, but you should not weaponize power in the way that we have witnessed, in the ways that we have witnessed the BPD do for generations. So I'm going to pass it on to Emma to close out the podcast.
Right. I mean, just as we started this podcast talking about, you know, how powerful the BPD is, how it's the second largest line item besides education when it comes to budget. Like, when we think about public safety, which is the purpose of the police, you know, things like investing in housing and education and community businesses and mental health resources, all of these things are investing in the safety of a community, you know? So prioritizing the BPD, you know, with like a track record of direct harm over actually investing in pieces of the community that people really need investment in, just shows, you know, what Boston's priority is. And that's just something that moving forward with the mayoral race, any community leaders, you know, within community in your circles, just talking about the way that the BPD exists within Boston and what the future of that should be, because we should have a say in that, is just what we need to move forward. So this has been the Gang Votes podcast. We'll be back with some more episodes shortly, and thank you for having us.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.